Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar in the Sirte and ESTCE webinar series. My name is Rula Deeb. I'm a Senior Principal at Geosyntec Consultants in Oakland, California, and the coordinator of the webinar series on behalf of Sirte and ESTCE. I will be facilitating today's call. The webinar will consist of a brief overview of both programs, followed by the technical portion of the webinar. Today's event focuses on Department of Defense research efforts from the Defense Coastal Estuarine Research Program. Dr. Patricia Cunningham, a Senior Research Scientist at RTI International, and Dr. Susan Cohen, a biologist at the Naval Facilities Engineering Command Engineering and Expeditionary Warfare Center, will discuss the results of their work and research on the effect of climate and military activities on ecosystem health at Marine Corps Base Camp Lejeune in North Carolina. Both their presentations will be followed by question and answer sessions. Today's broadcast will be listen only. You may submit questions by using the chat box on the left-hand portion of the screen. You do not need to wait until the Q&A period to submit your questions. In fact, we do encourage you to submit questions well in advance of the Q&A sessions. On this slide, we have provided you with a few suggestions in case you experience difficulties with the broadcast audio. Typically, any delay can be fixed if you refresh your screen or call into the conference line shown here. However, if you continue to have problems, please submit a question using the chat box in the lower left corner of your screen. With that, I would like to introduce Dr. Curt Preston, who is the Sirte Program Manager for Resource Conservation and Resiliency. Dr. Preston has tracked his career between civilian university and military positions. Prior to his current position with Sirte, he was a faculty member and research administrator at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where he led faculty development efforts to improve research competitiveness. He also worked with technology transfer personnel, academic departments, and colleges to build university research capability. Dr. Preston also served as a member of Chief of the Army Corps of Engineers Environmental Advisory Board. Curt?
Thank you, Rula. I'm happy to welcome everyone to today's Sirte and ESTCE webinar. Sirte is the Strategic Environmental Research and Development Program, which was established in 1991 by Congress as a partnership between the Department of Defense, the Department of Energy, and the EPA. Sirte's mission is to identify and address high-priority environmental science and technology opportunities that focus on Department of Defense requirements. Sirte funds both fundamental research as well as advanced technology development that ultimately impacts real-world environmental management. ESTCE is the Environmental Security Technology Certification Program, in which we demonstrate innovative environmental and energy technologies. These investments capitalize on past investments under Sirte and other research programs and are designed to transition technologies out of the lab and into the field. Especially important in all ESTCE demonstrations is the ultimate transition to implementation and regulatory acceptance. Sirte and ESTCE are complementary programs, with much of Sirte research occurring in the lab and pilot scale with occasional field efforts, while ESTCE demonstrations are primarily at the pilot and field scale, though occasionally supporting lab efforts are conducted. There are 4 program areas in Sirte and 5 program areas in ESTCE. The Energy and Water Program area is only in ESTCP, while the other 4, Environmental Restoration, Munitions Response, Resource Conservation and Resiliency, and Weapons Systems and Platforms, are CERTIP and ESTCP programs managed jointly by a designated program manager. Our webinar today is focused on research and demonstrations that were conducted under the Resource Conservation and Resiliency Program area, which has 3 research thrust areas: natural resources, wildland fire, and resiliency. Our webinar series highlights research and demonstration efforts in all of the 5 program areas. As you can see, upcoming webinars will cover a broad range of topics. The next Resource Conservation and Resiliency webinar is on August 16th, and it will showcase CERTIP and ESTCP funded projects on plant species recovery. You can find more information about upcoming webinars at this link. Registration is now live for webinars through to the end of the year. I would like to remind you that a copy of the presentation of today's session can be downloaded from our webinar webpage. We would appreciate it if you can please take a moment to complete the survey that will pop up on your screen at the end of this webcast. Finally, I am pleased to announce that the CERTIP ESTCP Symposium will be held for the 2nd year in a row this upcoming November in Washington, D.C. The 3-day event will showcase the latest technologies that embrace DoD's mission through improved environmental and energy performance. Registration is available on the CERTIP and ESTC website. And I hope you enjoy today's webinar.
Thank you, Curt. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Patricia Cunningham, who is a Senior Research Scientist at RDI International, located in Research Triangle Park in North Carolina. Since 2007, Dr. Cunningham's research has focused on ecosystem-based management as part of the Defense Coastal Estuarine Research Program conducted at Marine Corps Base Camp Lejeune. Dr. Cunningham has experience in providing technical support for numerous U.S. EPA water quality projects. She has assisted several states with both point and non-point source water quality issues, has developed 2 national EPA guidance documents and a database on fish advisory issues, and has managed the development of 5 EPA national coastal condition reports summarizing estuarine coastal water quality challenges. Dr. Cunningham earned a bachelor's degree in biology from Wells College in New York, and also holds master's and doctoral degrees in biological sciences from the University of Delaware in Newark. Pat, I turn it over to you now.
Thank you very much, Rula. Just briefly, I'll provide you a little background on the DCERP program, the research approaches and objectives, and then get right into the meat of the talk about the aquatic estuarine ecosystem and coastal wetlands. And Susan is going to be following up and covering the other 2 ecosystems that were studied at Marine Corps Base Camp Lejeune. This is the DCERP sort of overarching strategy, and we created a conceptual model for this. For those of you that don't know that much about DCERP, we started in 2007, and we continued monitoring and research through 2017. The program was originally conceived as a 10-year, highly integrated monitoring, research, and modeling effort. It was led by RTI International, but we also included 25 senior researchers from 8 universities, 3 federal agencies, and 4 small businesses. primarily from North Carolina, Virginia, South Carolina, and Connecticut. DCERP is a fairly unique program. It received review by a technical advisory committee throughout the 10-year program. So we had a staff of other scientists who were providing input and recommendations on our research efforts. We also had a stakeholder input from the Regional Coordinating Committee, and these included people that were involved in coastal issues in the state of North Carolina. We had representatives from the Albemarle-Pamlico National Estuary Program, the state fisheries, and NGOs like the Nature Conservancy and like that. We developed a lot of information. We have about 50 data sets and 30 million records and counting. And this is included in the Data and Information Management System called DIMS, which is available on our website that you will see at the end of the program. Turning to the diagram, just to briefly show you, in the upper left-hand corner, you start with the New River that flows into the estuary. And we were looking at processes associated with phytoplankton blooms, a carbon analysis, and also sediment accretion and erosion processes in the estuary and across the coastal barrier island of Onslow Beach. We are very interested in overwash of this area because this is a very important area to the installation. And in the terrestrial realm, we were looking at forestry management practices and habitat requirements for RCWs, or red cockaded woodpeckers, an important endangered species on the beach. We also had a climate change group, and we were looking at 4 climate drivers: warming temperatures, variability in precipitation, episodic events such as hurricanes, and of course sea level rise. And we got information on sea level rise from Sirte. They provided all of that. Our technical objectives to start out with were to understand ecosystem function and various processes at the base, and to determine how these processes responded to climate change or might respond to climate change. We developed models and to look at current and future ecosystem changes. We developed a coastal carbon budget, and a very important part of DCERP was to share our scientific knowledge not only with the scientific community and DoD managers, but with other coastal managers and the public as well. Our technical approach started with our team identifying ecosystem processes and stressors to these systems. And we then developed conceptual models both for the program and for each of the ecosystems that were being studied. We also had several meetings with the base staff to learn what their critical management needs are. For instance, they were very concerned about the erosion of Onslow Beach because they use it as an amphibious training facility. So we tried to incorporate all of their critical management needs into our conceptual model and our design of the integrated monitoring and research activities. Then from there, we went on to identify indicators and develop tools and models that we could use to do our climate change and our landscape changes into the future. And we provided the information to the base in a format that they could use as actionable information to make decisions. And lastly, we recommended a basic monitoring program for the installation. The aquatic estuarine ecosystem was the largest team on the DCERP program, and here are all of the participants from 4 universities and a small business, as well as an individual who was at the University of North Carolina and obtained a job in Australia, but continued to work on our program. We had a very dedicated group. Just to discuss briefly for a minute the research and monitoring aspects of our program. We had a highly integrated research and monitoring effort, especially in the estuary where we were looking at the carbon analysis. We had monthly fixed station monitoring. As you can see in the map, the 8 stations here were monitored for the mid-line of the estuary. There were also 10 additional stations monitored in the shallows. At the green squares on the map, this is where we had continuous autonomous vertical profilers that were sampling the water column every 6 minutes. One of them is shown here as a floating platform to the right of the map. We also did seasonal data flow cruises. On the far right, you can see chlorophyll A, and this is the trace of the boat as it went up through the estuary, and we could drive the boat up and get continuous measurements during these seasonal cruises. We also did low flow as well as storm flow monitoring in the New River and also in the tributary creeks feeding the estuary. And lastly, we did post-storm and pre-storm monitoring. If we knew there was a nor'easter or a hurricane coming through, the teams would go out and monitor before the hurricane and after as well. So getting right into some of our findings that have, I think, been published by now, although they may still be in press. About 15 miles north of Jacksonville, which sits at the head of the estuary, is the USGS gauging station at Gum Branch. And our researcher, Scott Ensign, went back through the records and discovered, and I might say here, that the gauging station has been collecting gauging data since the 1950s. It's one of the longest running USGS gauges in North Carolina. And it hasn't run continuously. There are a couple of years that were missed, but it's been definitely continuous from the 1970s onward. So looking at this gauge printout for 1972, these are all the same dates in different years. You'll see that there's a very smooth curve, and this just gives you the height of water at the gauge. And as you move into 1988, you'll see that there are little up and down motions of the gauge, and by 2013 you see this up and down movement, especially at these low flow periods. And this was determined to correspond to high tide and low tide at the inlet. So this is our evidence for the tidal excursion at Gum Branch. As far as the New River estuary, it has a long history of being very eutrophic. They had lots of algal blooms, fish kills. So one of the things we wanted to look at was the nutrients that might be driving the system. And looking here, you have the nutrient loading as well as the residence time of water in the estuary are both determined by river flow. And to show you, at the very highest flows, say 300 meter cubed per second, the drop of water at Jacksonville will take less than 3 days to get to the inlet, however, which is about 25 miles away. But at low flow, say 10 meter cubed per second, it will take 120 to 150 days to travel that same distance. So the river really controls the residence time of water in the estuary. Another thing we wanted to look at was what the sources of nutrient loading to the estuary were. And our group determined that the largest volume of nutrients were coming from off base in the upper watershed. And I have on the Google map here showing you the headwaters that wind down into the estuary, and you can see the two main tributaries to the left and right, and then you flow into the main channel and down out to the inlet. So with regard to the annual contributions, Marine Corps Base Camp Lejeune's runoff only adds 8% of the annual contribution to nitrogen. The wastewater treatment plant on the base contributes 7%, so 15% only is contributed by the base. Most is from the upper watershed. Now, to study this, the impact of the nutrients, they had a process where they filtered water and then inoculated the bottles with the same volume of phytoplankton, and they added either nitrogen compounds or phosphate or a combination thereof. And then they incubated these out in the estuary in normal sunlight. And you can see here, this is, the first column is ammonium, second column is nitrate, and the third one is ammonium and nitrate. And this is the percent of the tests that turned out to be greater than the control. So these nitrogen compounds all caused an increase in phytoplankton production. Then you can see the gap is phosphate. So phosphate really had no effect. And these other three bars are the same nitrogen compounds as in the first three bars with the addition of phosphate. And again, phosphate has no effect. So I want to go back here for a minute to talk about the residence time of water in the estuary and give you a little picture about what happens. During 2008, 2009, and 2010, we studied the estuary. 2008 turned out to be a very low rainfall year, and therefore it was a low river flow year. And because of that, the water clarity was extremely high, and I ranked it as a 3 here. And that was because sediment input and loading and nutrient loading were both very low. The blooms were fairly low. They usually occurred in the upper part of the estuary, and CDOM, as chromophoric dissolved organic matter, was also low. This is the black water, sort of tannic waters that are created in southeast rivers. Furthermore, the benthic microalgae were very happy because of the water clarity. Sunlight reached to the bottom of the euphotic zone. They would take up nutrients and create a nice mat of microalgae on the bottom. And they were taking nutrients out of the water column, which helped reduce the bloom potential of the phytoplankton. Also at this time, you had a large intrusion of salt water into the estuary. At Jacksonville, oftentimes the salinity is only about 5 to 10 parts per thousand. And during this year, it got up to 25 parts per thousand. And hypoxia was not much of a problem during this time period. If we move on to the moderate river flow, you can see there's more rainfall, so more CDOM, more nutrients, and more sediment are all washing into the estuary. The benthic microalgae are being shaded from sunlight by all of this suspended material in the water column, so the water clarity drops. The blooms increase because there's more nutrients. Salinity is not as high as in the first instance, but still fairly high. And now you get hypoxia. And this is when the salt water moves into the estuary along the bottom of the estuary, and the fresh water that is less dense floats above it. And as bacteria along the bottom of the estuary are decomposing matters, reduces the dissolved oxygen. So it creates hypoxia, which is injurious to a lot of bottom dwellers. And here's the high flow scenario where you have poor water clarity, a lot of sediment, a lot of nutrients, but unexpectedly you don't have a lot of blooms. And the reason being is because the flow is so fast through the estuary that the phytoplankton don't have time to really assimilate a lot of the nutrients. The salinity is overall fairly low, and hypoxia is also increasing because the benthic microalgae by this point are unable to undergo much photosynthesis because the water clarity is so low, and they begin releasing more nutrients into the estuary. So this is a way that the estuary actually gets cleaned out over time. Now, we looked at the hot spots for these phytoplankton blooms, and each of the columns here with the red and green show the red are water quality exceedances. If the chlorophyll A value exceeded 40, which is the North Carolina chlorophyll A standard, then the column was colored red. The green values are all below the exceedance value. And if we look over here at the map, you can see, you can see the various assessment units. AU, the top assessment unit, AU 19-10.5, corresponds to the top row of the other graphic. And you can see that the most of the exceedances are very, very high in the main part of the estuary above where the two tributary creeks come in. And the two tributary creeks are also have a high rate of exceedance. So one of our researchers developed the estuarine simulation model because we wanted to know what climatic factors and other human stressors in the future might influence the number of days where we would have chlorophyll A exceedances, and also the number of days when you might have bottom water hypoxia. So box 1 is up at Jacksonville, box 7 is down at the inlet. So we looked at the current condition where you have about 325 days up at Jacksonville where chlorophyll A exceeds the standard. And it goes down fairly rapidly until you get to the bottom of the estuary, and there's very little chlorophyll A exceedances down in this portion of the estuary. If we half the nitrogen that's going into the system, we found that this will indeed decrease the chlorophyll A exceedances, the number of days. And if we decrease the nutrients by half and increase the temperature, which is anticipated to rise by about 5 degrees centigrade by the year 2100 in Onslow County, then again we get a further decrease in the number of days where you have an exceedance. If we look at bottom oxygen, however, the standard for that is 5 milligrams per liter. So the blue line is the current condition, and you can see that, again, the hypoxic events occur most frequently and up by Jacksonville, and least frequently down near the inlet where there's much more tidal flushing. If we reduce the nutrients in the orange graph, you can see that there is a decline in bottom water hypoxia. But that same reduction in nutrients and an increase in temperature shows you that you're getting more hypoxia rather than less, despite the fact that you've removed half of the nitrogen from the system. So current management strategies may not work as well. So the benefits to DoD with regard to the aquatic estuarine ecosystem. Water quality management really must be looked at on a watershed basis. The base is not adding a lot to the nitrogen load, but in order for the New River estuary to remain in prime condition for human uses as well as fish and wildlife and any other use, it has to be a collaborative effort of the base, the City of Jacksonville, and Onslow County together to work at these problems. We also feel that monitoring essential parameters has got to continue to understand issues, sources, and remedies for this estuary and for any other. Future land use and climate will definitely complicate management for water quality managers. And we have cautioned the installation that land use changes will occur over time. If they have a grow the force, they may be putting up more dormitories, more administrative buildings, more highways, more housing, and all of this will increase runoff and affect the water quality. And above all, management options need to be adaptable. If you see something isn't working, then try something else. And the sustainability of all the ecosystem services for the watershed should be a top priority, not only for this individual installation, but also for the people of the county of Onslow County, North Carolina. The next ecosystem I want to talk about is the coastal wetlands. And this was led in large part by Carolyn Kern of NOAA's Morehead City Laboratory. We had other individuals also, some of whom were also on the estuary team as well. At Marine Corps Base Camp Lejeune, the coastal wetlands take up about 2,600 acres of the 150,000 acres of the base, so they're less than about 2%. There are two species that predominate, the Juncus marshes that border the New River estuary itself, and also the back barrier of the Onslow Beach, the barrier island, and then Spartina marshes, which flourish in the mainland side of the intercoastal waterway. And can be flooded, are much more flood tolerant than Juncus. There are a lot of benefits to coastal wetlands, and I won't review those, but the real challenges I want to talk about are sea level rise and the construction and maintenance of the intracoastal waterway. And if you look at the map here at of the base, you can see that the yellow area along the right-hand margin of the map are the Spartina marshes. And you can see intermingled in there, some of the green dots are the Juncus marshes. Now, one thing Carolyn and her group did in DCERP 1 was to determine what the erosion rate of the shoreline of the estuary was. And over a 48-year period, there was actually a fair amount of erosion. And the different rates of erosion are shown by the colors. The red is an erosion rate of 1.5 to 2.3 meters per year, and then you have the purple and the blue, the cooler colors, which show you that there was little erosion in some of the more sheltered areas of the estuary. It turns out that the average erosion rate within the estuary was 30 feet over a 48-year period. And that sediment banks were the major source of sediment to the estuary. And it's important to note that they calculated that about 18,000 cubic meters per year of sediment erodes from the estuarine shoreline, and that the marshes in the lower part of the estuary need 12,000 cubic meters per year to just stay up with sea level rise, the current rate of sea level rise. So erosion is not bad for a marsh. If the marsh can get the sediment that's eroding, it can keep pace with sea level rise. In addition to doing this analysis during DCERP 2, as a management activity, they started looking at living shoreline and installations around the base. Because if you put a bulkhead up, that's fine. It's a very short-term fix. But if you can install or reinstall a shoreline, a living shoreline of marsh plants, within about 3 years, you can't even tell where you've put the installation. It's grown to look like a natural marsh, and you reap so many more ecosystem services from that than you would by putting in an armored cement wall. And they determined in looking at the wave activity and wave strength within the estuary that every part of both the intercoastal waterway and the estuary could be acceptable places for living shoreline installations. And there are two types. The blue is marsh installations where you have oyster culch that is put a little bit offshore of the planted marsh plants. It breaks up the wave activity, and in stronger wave action areas, you use stone sills. You can see that the marshes of the base are keeping pace, and this is just to show you that this marsh, the Freeman Creek Marsh, is at the lowest elevation. It's along the ICW, and yet it has the highest rate of accretion of any of the marshes. The Onslow Beach one is the back barrier marsh on the island, and the MBH marsh is Mile Hammock Bay, which is in the lower estuary. Elevation of the marshes is maintained by the sediment supply, and the sediment supply is very, very local. And this diagram shows you that suspended sediment in the water column floats in the micro layer, and as the tide proceeds in over the marsh, these very, very fine sediment particles deposit on the surface of the marsh. And in the marsh area that they were monitoring, they found that there was 513 kilograms per 12 hours of sediment deposited on the marsh. And this was far more sediment that was deposited than was brought in by a storm event. We used the Geospatial Marsh model on the Freeman Creek Marsh. This is the marsh down that borders the intercoastal waterway, and the has a very flat slope to it. So this particular marsh is capable of migrating as sea level rises, and it's one of the more resilient of the marshes at Camp Lejeune. We used the Geospatial Marsh model with 5 different sea level rise rates, and especially at the Freeman Creek site, you can see that the vegetation expanded horizontally, and you actually got a larger extent of marsh than you did previously. So here you have a 2013. If you assume a sea level rise rate by 2100 of 0.8 meters, this is what the marsh would look like. A lot of Spartina, the light green, and Juncus, the sort of brownish green here. However, if you select the worst case scenario of a sea level rise rate of 2.5 by 2065, you still have a lot of marsh. It's expanding horizontally toward the uplands, and it's in pretty good condition, but by 2100, most of the marsh in the lower right has turned into water. And this is a similar pattern across many of the U.S. Atlantic coast marshes. So the benefits to DOD from the coastal marshes. maintain resilience of the marshes by implementing management solutions. We've talked about living shoreline installations. This is like planting bulbs in a way, digging holes in wet sand and putting these marsh plants in and protecting them from wave action. Carolyn Curran is also working on thin layer applications of dredge material, and you can see that in this picture. She used these fiber core sort of logs to create rectangular application sites, and she applied between 6 and 8 inches of dredge material, and she started this last summer near the end of DCERP, and we'll be following it for a year or two, and so we don't have the final results of this, but this is a possible solution also. In the estuary, any place where you have and can keep natural shoreline helps maintain sediment supply. You don't want to put up revetments or bulkheads in a large percentage of the new river estuary, for instance, because it's going to cut off your sediment supply, which is desperately needed by marshes. And a very inexpensive way to help the marshes like the Freeman Creek marsh is to provide an upland buffer to allow the marshes to migrate. And of course, preserve the ecosystem services of marshes. Okay, that's the end of part 1 of the webinar.
Thank you so much, Pat. I would like to remind our audience to submit questions by using the chat box on the left-hand portion of the screen. We have received a number of questions for you. As a result of your research, were you able to develop a sustainable monitoring system and transfer that to stakeholders? And if so, did you observe any barriers to this process that are notable?
Well, we came up with recommendations for the base and its monitoring program. And we didn't really specifically design anything for stakeholders, although of course we're publishing the final report, which will have all of the information in it. So the base has its own program, and we're working with them to make our final recommendations. And whether they can implement all of them is up to them, really, and how much they want to spend on the program.
Thank you. Are there any predictive models that are available for algal blooms in inland lakes?
I don't know of any as such, but if the questioner sends me their name and address, I might be able to ask the algologist on the team if there are, and pass that information along to you.
Great. A question from EPA. Does land use allow any room for marshes to migrate?
Well, what we're recommending to the base is that they set pretty wide buffers and not build hard infrastructure near the coast or shoreline of the estuary, or obviously the shoreline of the intercoastal waterway. But the extent of the buffer depends on the elevation of the land. You can't really establish a setback. It's got to be done on a sort of a case-by-case basis, and based on what you feel will be an appropriate risk from sea level rise. Some people want to be conservative and say, use the worst case scenario and say, let's have a setback that is that far back and will accommodate a 2.5 meter sea level rise by 2100. That might not be either appropriate because there is other infrastructure there, or the base may not be able to do that for various reasons. So it has to be done on a case-by-case basis, really.
Great. And one last quick question before we move on to the second portion of the technical presentation. What are possible land management techniques upland to help marshes keep up with sea level rise?
Could you repeat that just one more time, please?
Yes. What are possible land management techniques upland to help marshes keep up with sea level rise?
I would say you don't necessarily have to do anything in the uplands except not put obstructions in the path of the marshes. Allow the marshes the largest available area that you can to migrate on their own.
Great. Thank you so much. At this point, we're going to move on to the second portion of the presentation, and we'll leave time towards the end to cover the remainder of the questions that we've received. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our next speaker, who is Dr. Susan Cohen. Susan is a biologist with NAVCAC Exwick, located in Port Hueneme, California. Since 2008, she has served as the on-site coordinator for the DCERP program. And prior to working with DoD, she worked as a research biologist with the U.S. Department of Agriculture Forest Service, Southern Research Station at Research Triangle Park in North Carolina. Susan earned a bachelor's degree in anthropology from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and also holds master's and doctoral degrees in forestry from NC State. Susan?
Excellent. Thanks, Rula, and thanks to everybody for sticking around. We can go ahead and go to slide 43, please. Perfect. Just to make sure we're all still on the same page after hearing from Pat, that's a lot of information. So we're in the 10th year, our closeout year of the Defense Coastal Estuarine Research Program, this highly integrated research and monitoring effort, tasked with really understanding how ecosystems work and respond to stressors, and how all this contributes to the sustainment of the military mission of training and readiness. So Pat went through the Aquatic Estuarine and Coastal Wetlands group, and I'm going to go to completely different directions on either end here, the lowest of elevation places, the coastal barrier system, and then we'll go into the terrestrial system. And while we've divided up the Camp Lejeune landscape into these ecosystem types to allow us to get a grip on it for study, we always paid attention to those fluxes between systems, whether it was sediment or nutrients or even the carbon flux between these systems. And I think you'll see that a little bit more. Pat talked about it quite a bit, and then you'll see a little bit more as we go to the coastal barrier system. So slide 44, please. Excellent, thank you. So this is Onslow Island, and I'm just going to give you just a flavor of the large body of work that went on by this coastal barrier team, and hopefully it'll entice y'all to pursue that area either on our website or through getting in touch with us, and we'll have that information for you at the end of the webinar. And the central questions that they were dealing with in this coastal barrier environment were understanding stressors and driving forces to the system, trying to predict that future morphology of the shoreline. So how is that barrier island evolving over time, specifically with regards to island transgression, and assess shorebird and loggerhead sea turtle habitats. And I'm not going to talk any more about that turtle seashore component. I just want you to be aware that we did it, and if that's of interest to you, we have some great information that we can follow up with. So Onslow Island has been reoriented in this top image here on this slide. It's really a northeast-southwest oriented island, but I will refer to the north end, and that's the area to the right in that top digital elevation model image. And the south end to the left, I'll just continuously refer to it as the south end. It's about 12 kilometers long. These barrier islands are just highly dynamic, and Onslow Beach in particular has huge variation just across the island itself, and that's really primarily due to the geomorphological variation that we see from south to north. The north end is high elevation, somewhat surprisingly so. It's really regressive with multiple dune ridges that can extend up to 10 meters. It has just this beautiful area of maritime forest behind it that then leads into the intracoastal waterway. And the island is somewhat bisected by a relatively ancient rock ridge that's millions of years old, and the north end tends to have a nice adequate sediment supply of unconsolidated quartz. But when you go to the south side of that bisected island, where that rock ridge lies, you start to get into an area with a long history of retreat. It's sediment starved. It's a really low elevation, narrow transgressive island at that southern end. So it's really an interesting tale of sort of two dynamics on the same island. And you can see that the island is subdivided up into a number of uses. The most important of those uses, of course, being as probably one of the premier amphibious training facilities, not just for Camp Lejeune, but for the Marine Corps and DoD at large. And it serves multiple purposes. Slide 45, please. So we'll start with the back side of Onslow Island, where that back barrier marsh is, and it's really being squeezed by the intracoastal waterway and the process of island rollover. And Pat talked a little bit about the intracoastal waterway and the marshes back there, and there's really a combination of drivers that are sort of squeezing that back barrier island marsh. There's the intracoastal waterway, and that's both boat wave energy, which I'll talk a little bit more about, and management of the intracoastal waterway, which we'll talk about in a second. And then the other one is really this overwash process. So that figure in the bottom left-hand corner, I should have put Jim Morris's name up there and given him his due credit. He's from the University of South Carolina, and this is his conceptual model. And the idea here is that aeolian transported sediment and overwash, which would have been destined for those mainland marshes, which are significantly lower in elevation, that sediment is being captured by the intracoastal waterway. And then it shoals up the intracoastal waterway, it is dredged, and then that sediment is generally disposed of onto a spoil island. So we have this sort of continuous process of sediment going over the barrier island, getting trapped in the intracoastal waterway, and then being removed from the system. And as Pat said, these sediment supplies are really, really local. And the middle area is just some overwash, and I'll talk about that on that next slide. And then I'll talk a little bit more about that boat wave energy, and you can see where there's been some major erosional responses. That figure on the far right is from the backside of Onslow Island. Slide 46, please, Rula. Thank you. I can't change slides, so I have to constantly ask for the next slide. So continuing on with this back barrier piece and focusing on the intracoastal waterway a little bit more, this is a really interesting legacy stressor on the landscape, and it has huge implications for, again, that sediment budget we talked about. But hydrology, carbon storage, just barrier island evolution in general, and it's a great example of a man-made legacy with decadal-long implications. So since the late 30s, the average width of the intracoastal waterway has essentially doubled. It's gone from about 65 meters to 149 meters. And we continue to see the erosion on either side, and it is almost exclusively from boat waves. And it's a little comfort as the intracoastal waterway widens, that energy diminishes, but it certainly will continue to be a long-term persistent problem. And again, the real implication for the barrier island is the impact on barrier rollover. So barrier rollover is not a new concept in coastal barrier science. It's that process, again, of sediment transport and building marshes onto the backside of the island as it tends to migrate landward. But now there's a water channel, both preventing it physically and capturing additional sediment. So this is a really interesting process, and it became abundantly clear through our research over the years that this island was facing stressors from multiple sides. And thinking about the Intracoastal Waterway and the impacts on the barrier islands sort of seemed, oh yeah, of course, in hindsight, but we'd never seen it really quantified to this degree and gotten such a great understanding of the process. Slide 47, please. So diving into this overwash process a little bit more that's affecting this back barrier evolution and the exchange with the Intracoastal Waterway. This is a mechanism by which sand is transported to the backside, islands roll over, and they build up. And in general, the prevailing theory for this type of overwash evolution is that you get a large deposition of a washover fan, usually resulting from a single storm, and then the dune line recovers rapidly in about a year's time, and again, that dune line is resilient to the washover process. So looking at that graphic a little bit, it looks a little bit confusing, but it really wonderfully illustrates that washover fans are not always event deposits, that they occur on fair weather days as often as they do, and often the volume over time is more. So we have the storms across the top, Irene, Sandy, Arthur, and Joaquin in combination with the nor'easter. As an aside, Irene and Arthur had pretty significant direct impacts on the island, whereas Sandy and Joaquin did not have any measurable direct impacts on the island, yet we see some interesting overwash growth following those storms. So the x-axis is time, and the big giant gray bars are vegetation, and if you pay attention to that scale on the vegetation cover, it really doesn't get above 10-12%, but it can be a little deceiving if you're not looking at it. And then the y-axis on the left is volume and area, and you can see that tracked in the lines and the corresponding dots. So you'll see that there was this large change in morphology following Sandy, which is really interesting because Sandy didn't really impact us. And then there was this sort of quiescent period where we didn't see overwash recovery, but we certainly saw this sort of same level trajectory. And then Arthur didn't really have much of an impact for growth, even though it directly impacted the island. And then Joaquin hit, and we saw this great increase in overwash size. So over time, we never hit that recovery trajectory. And spring tides still overwash this area, and those three images really show you how this area has grown. And you start to get a sense of just how much sediment can be transported to the backside of the island. And is what we found when we dug down through histories of cores going back almost 1,000 years, looking at washover events and looking at relative sea level rise and increases in storminess over the last 100 years, that this behavior that we see of overwash is really linked to the rate of relative sea level rise and not to an increase in storminess, which we did not detect over the last 100 years. So this is an incredibly important process, and a shout out to the folks at IMS, Institute of Marine Science, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, for doing this work. And really, this is one of the few instances that we've ever seen of this intensive level of monitoring of overwashes. So really quickly, slide 48, and I've sort of lost track of my time as well due to my computer failure. Just very quickly, we did some numerical morphology modeling, predicting sediment and water based on the forcings of tide, surge, relative sea level rise, and beach morphology, predicted shoreline position from 2009 to 2065 on a decadal basis. And it doesn't take rocket science to see the trajectory of erosion at the south end of Onslow Beach, but it was nice to be able to quantify it and to be able to present this to the installation commanders, because there seems to be a dramatic difference in response when you can actually see a finding rather than assuming a finding. So this was great work, and we can certainly provide more information to anybody who is interested in that. Slide 49, please, Lula. So just a couple quick summary points. We know natural stressors drive island change. We did a relatively exhaustive exercise looking at the military impacts on the island, and that was one of the more surprising findings, was that military impacts from training are really well constrained within some pretty dramatic natural stressors on the island. The north half of the island is stable, if not accreting, which is the exact opposite of the south end. We think there are probably some engineered solutions. If you ask me personally, I think adaptation is the way to go when we're talking about this barrier island. And again, carbon stocks are difficult to manage when a major location of that storage, that back barrier marsh, is being eroded. Next slide, please, Rula. Slide 50. So jumping up in elevation, going much higher into the landscape. I'm going to probably skip a few slides here just so we stay on time and have time for some questions. But quickly, Marine Corps Base Camp Lejeune definitely encompasses the full complement of ecosystems on the lower coastal plain of the mid-Atlantic, and that includes major gradients from maritime inland and from very wet to very droughty sites, and the landscape is greatly altered. Some of it doesn't appear to be altered, but there's not a spot of forest on Camp Lejeune that has not been altered in some way. And this is a working forest. There's about 80,000 acres of managed forest on Camp Lejeune. Clearly, it is important as a training component, but it's also a working forestry landscape and is managed ecologically for endangered species and is used also recreationally and hunted. So a really important resource for a number of reasons. Slide 51, please. So this conceptual model hopefully calls a little bit of attention to that variety, where you see we move from that maritime gradient upward. Fire is unquestionably the dominant force across this landscape, and it occurs in different frequencies and different intensities in different ecosystem types, and we have a really nice historic record on that. And I'm going to really start off by focusing on some of that biodiversity variation on both a spatial and temporal scale. Slide 52, please. So our central questions can really kind of be divided up into some categories. That first question there is really about causes. What factors determine variation across this landscape? And we have a pretty good grip on that, I think. And then that second bullet really talks to connections. We were interested in that connection between plant composition and diversity and avian composition and diversity on same sites. And then the bottom three questions are really about consequences. So what is the consequence of managing for a single species? RCW is red-cockaded woodpecker, and it has been the most expensive, threatened, and endangered federally listed species for the Department of Defense, both time-wise and money-wise. So it is not a casual undertaking that DoD takes when they're managing for RCWs. How good are our restoration efforts, and what will future climates bring? And I'm probably just going to leave that hanging as a teaser for folks to follow up on it if that is their interest. Slide 53, please. So super quick on the methods, not giving you any meaningful information at all about it. We worked in 132 permanent sample plots, used very traditional, rigorous methods to sample vegetation, soil, and bird species, and really covered the extent of the Camp Lejeune landscape. Slide 54, please. Save a little bit of time. So this is an ordination of Camp Lejeune's terrestrial vegetation of those 132 plots. So this really represents the differences among samples. And these plots on the whole represent over 600 species of vascular plants. So the closer the dots are together, the more similar they are compositionally. And the axes really represent trends in composition, and they reflect a maritime assembly. So the x-axis, as you go from right to left, obviously is a maritime beach dune environment, and you move inland as you go. And that y-axis really started to fall out for moisture conditions. So as you go from the top of the y-axis with wetlands and hardwoods, and we should have Picosans split out in there, but we really don't, and go to the south, we tend to get more drier conditions. So this is a really nice two-dimensional representation of a great many species by the most influential factors on the installation. So about 80% of the base collectively is some type of pine forest, and that is the longleaf, the loblolly, and again, that Picosan is really kind of worked into the wetlands. That's pond pine, those pink dots, some of that actually represents Pocosin rather than, say, saltwater wetlands. And that represents the majority of managed and utilized forest land on the installation, and it has been tremendously influenced by disturbance and fire history, whether burning now or the past where we saw a lot of fire suppression influencing these stands. And that's what the major trends are along. So that soil gradients, disturbance history, and as that relates to fire. So I'm going to focus on pine species really from here on out. Slide 55, please. So walking you through this a little bit, again, this is focused on the majority of pine species, so longleaf pine, loblolly pine, and high Pocosins, and their associated plant communities, of course. The graphic on the left just shows the nice relationship between plant species richness and bird species richness across the plots that were sampled. And longleaf is green on the 4 ordination plots that are clustered together, and the circles are the plants, and the diamonds are the bird community. And then the same thing for loblolly, which is that bluish purple, and then the high Pocosin, which is pink, and you start to see these clusters start to fall apart. They've come together, actually, not fall apart. Where they start to fall apart a little bit is at their ecotone, probably. So the scatter of plots is really highly correlated for us. We don't really necessarily get at the mechanisms behind some of these relationships, but the repeated pattern we see over time and across species really suggests that increasing plant diversity or managing for plant diversity really confers that same type of diversity response from the avian community and vice versa. We can predict the vegetation. If you know something about the soil and disturbance, we can predict the vegetation, and then we can also predict the bird community from the vegetation. So we really started to take comfort in this tight connection between plant diversity and bird diversity, suggesting if you manage for one, you're probably managing for the other. Slide 56, please. And Rula, I know you're getting nervous about the time, so I'm going to wrap this up pretty quickly. We did examine the impact of single-species management, red-cockaded woodpeckers, on other species, particularly considering the investment and time and energy that goes into managing RCWs. And we examined that using the U.S. Fish and Wildlife matrix categorization of suitable habitat for RCWs in longleaf pines. And a score of 5 represents the most ideal of habitat types, and the score of 1 to 2 represents more like that image that you see there, where you have a well-developed mid-story, almost no herbaceous understory, no sunlight is getting through the canopy, the site carrying a really high basal area. So we have this gradient of habitat suitability, and when we start to look at other species of birds that are occurring in sites of 4 and 5 matrix scores, it's really kind of an interesting result. So really, if you'll go to slide 57, please. And I'm just going to point out the graphic on the very left where we have a habitat matrix score on the bottom, again going from sort of worst to best, if you will, and the average number of species at each bird sampling point. And we see a really nice relationship between bird diversity and RCW habitat score, which is primarily managing for RCWs. So we really like RCWs as an umbrella species. And I think a lot of us that have worked in longleaf pine for many years would have assumed this, but now it's a whole different thing to be able to quantify it. And we saw sort of guilds associated with this improvement that we didn't necessarily expect. Like species that we typically find in hardwood habitats also showed improvement. The one guild that we didn't see really improve with increasing matrix score was that of sort of that shrubby forest land, places where you tend to find species like Carolina wrens. We did see a negative association with those. But overall, this was a great reassuring finding to be able to take to the installation. Slide 58, please. We did a really large experiment looking at restoration efforts, and essentially we looked at a mid-story mechanical fin to return the structure of what is a loblolly pine shrub-dominated stand into something that really resembles a park-like savanna, what we think of when we think of longleaf pine habitat. And you can see that conversion in those 3 photos. A completely probably habitat score 1 or 2 in the RCW matrix on the left, then we do a mechanical thinning and we burn it, and we come up with this structure that really starts to get at a longleaf pine habitat structure. And I'll just say one really significant challenge is the majority of trees that you see in that photo to the far right that looks more savanna-like, those are loblolly pine. Those are not longleaf. And loblolly is a prolific cedar and early competitor in early successional stands. And that is a major challenge, is to be able to control the loblolly pine regeneration. So we will go to the next slide, please. Roll slide 59, and we will show some photos of before and after. So the 2010 is, we went in, we did this mechanical removal of the mid-story, we burned it. The intent was to burn again in 2013 and sample along this 3-year fire interval, but we couldn't get fire in there, so in 2016 we decided to go back in and sample, and that's what it looked like. All the ground we had gained had essentially been lost. Slide 60, please. And you can see that in these bar charts. With regards to stem density, we made huge gains, obviously doing a mechanical removal, in removing mid-story stem density, but by 2016 we had lost all of those gains. And the same is true for plant species richness. So the idea that we can restore these sites and get them on a trajectory to some desired condition, you can do it, but if you can't keep up on these wet sites with fire, you're probably going to lose any gains you made. Slide 61, please. This is just a quick finding with the bird species also on that same experiment. So the y-axis represents moisture, mesic to wet, mesic to hypococin, and the x-axis represents shifts in bird composition and diversity, and to the right would represent a decline in species diversity and a shift in composition. So each arrow represents a plot. The pointy end is 2016, the not pointy end is 2010, and almost every plot is moving back towards fewer species and a more restricted composition of those species. Slide 62, Rula, and I will wrap this up. Thank you. So just a couple of quick conclusions. Mid-story thinning does work, but if you can't follow it up with fire, you may want to reconsider it as an active tool. Restoration is harder as you go from dry sites to wet sites. The majority of extant longleaf pine sites that we consider to be good quality and representing some type of target are really dry sites. You know, these sites that weren't suitable for agriculture or development in any other way in the past, they may have been logged, but they tended to not sustain a lot of soil disturbance. So these are really the easier sites to restore, and you don't lose them quite as fast in the absence of fire. These wet sites will present a significant challenge for restoration, but in my mind, they're also more important because they are really poorly represented among extant, what we consider sort of intact longleaf pine sites today. The third bullet is just a teaser for you. We did study RCWs and climate, and I encourage folks to get in touch if there are some connections there that we should be making. And last slide, 63, Rula, please. So carbon is also something we looked at, interestingly enough. Turns out you're managing for carbon if you're managing for longleaf pine, even if you don't mean to be managing for carbon. And that is a real delight for base managers to hear, because it is hard for folks to wrap their head around starting to manage and account for carbon. But we really do believe there will be a future DoD scenario where installations in some way are going to have to do some carbon accounting, and longleaf pine forest stand types really represent a great opportunity there. So lastly, on slide 64, Rula, is how you get onto our website, and we have an interactive mapping tool there as well. You can explore our raw data, you can explore our synthesized data. We have images and story maps and all kinds of interesting ways to learn about what we've done. Anyone can go on the public website, and we just ask you to register if you want to get into our data and start exploring. And I believe on slide 65, there's also my contact information, and because this was such a big information dump over such a short period of time. I hope folks will get in touch with me if there are any questions that we don't get to today. Whew, and I talked faster than Pat.
Well, you did great. Thank you so much, Susan. We have a number of questions for you, starting with the following. If adaptation is the default policy, is it possible to meet DoD species diversity goals going forward?
So that's an interesting question. So I guess it depends a little bit how you define adaptation. So for me, adaptation, say in the context of the coastal barrier island, means we're not doing any changes and we're going to shift how we use it, and it'll be dictated by how the island changes on its own. So I think there is room for managing for species, because we've seen really successful synergistic activities on that coastal barrier island where we're managing for piping plovers and sea beach amaranth and loggerhead sea turtles, and training is not challenged by that. Training and management have gone hand in hand, and I see no reason, even within an adaptation framework, that can't keep occurring. There may need to be a little more coordination and a little more purpose into the future as perhaps the available land area of the coastal barrier islands, sticking with that example, as that land area perhaps shrinks a little bit, but I see no reason to think that they can't continue to complementarily move forward into the future. And I think that's also the case for the terrestrial habitat, but I don't think we'll see as much adaptation there as we will mitigation.
Great, thank you, Susan. What are the management options for the intercoastal waterway and associated marshes?
So that's a great question, and I think that the answer is somewhat simple in a way, although maybe not satisfying. So I think one thing you do is you talk to the Army Corps of Engineers. Perhaps there are no wake zones we need to implement. Perhaps there is a different management with regards to dredging we need to implement. So there's certainly coordination between managing agencies that would be an option. There is definitely an option in certain areas for living shorelines, as Pat mentioned, and whether that is simply planting marsh grasses or using some type of combination of a marsh sill where you have a little bit higher energy. And then there are going to be some options like this thin layer application. So I think it's going to take a concerted effort on multiple fronts, and I think a lot of these solutions will ultimately sort of be short term, but I think in the really long term, out to 2100, there's going to have to be some interesting and high-level conversations about the future of the intercoastal waterway. And I definitely think there are some things that can be done in the coming decades to slow these processes down.
Great, thank you. Can you tell us if Camp Lejeune has any management plans for Oslo Beach?
So there are no active management plans with regards to things like renourishment. I rushed through it, of course, but there is very little sediment available for essentially the two-thirds bottom half of the island. So there's a really limited sand source, and you're facing not just renourishment once, you're facing it really into perpetuity, and maybe that frequency shifts over time with storms and nor'easters. But so there is not a reliable sand source. So that is an extreme response that will require really costly investment over time. The north end has a great sediment supply, and that's evidenced by the fact that it is stable, if not slightly accreting. So there are currently no plans to address management from a renourishment perspective. I can tell you the installation has taken a hard look at the limited infrastructure they have, and it really is limited. And they are committed to not investing in more infrastructure. You know, maybe there's a beach pavilion here or there for folks to rinse off when they come off the beach, but they have certainly recognized that there is no reason to put more infrastructure there that has any value or high utility because it simply isn't sustainable. So that's certainly a first move. And they are thinking about long-term planning. Where will Where will training occur? Where will recreation occur? Where do those things need to overlap, and how can we coordinate them? And there's always going to be a place where water meets land, right? There's always going to be a beach. It just not maybe the extent that they're used to and in the same place that they're used to. So they are certainly looking forward into the future, and there's lots of things on the table.
Great, thank you so much. One last question, and then I'd like to pull Pat back in and maybe ask some broader questions related to today's topic. Can you tell us if Camp Lejeune plans to continue using the mechanical mid-story management technique going into the future?
They definitely plan on continuing to use it. In addition to a lot of other options that are in, that big forestry toolbox, whether it be very selective targeted use of herbicides or very selective targeted use of maybe a single pass bed. But it is, they have become keenly aware that if you cannot follow up on these mechanical thinning sites with fire, you're kind of wasting your time. Now, you can't always plan for every contingency, and clearly there's going to be some instances where you do a mechanical thinning and you can't come in with fire when you need to, and that's okay. You keep trying. But to know that you can lose essentially any gains in a site in just a matter of 5 years is pretty extraordinary. And again, I think anybody who's worked in the longleaf world would have guessed that, particularly in these wet sites. But to really quantify it and see shifts in individual species, I didn't have an opportunity to get into actual individual species and indicators and some of the interesting compositional changes that occurred in the site. But it's a valuable tool when you can implement it, and it's definitely not going to go away wholesale, and it will always be used in some way.
Great, thank you. So moving on to some broader topics, Susan, what are some of the lessons learned from developing an integrated monitoring research program that should be considered by other DCERP-like programs? Can you start us off with your response, and then we'll ask Pat to weigh in?
I'm going to need another hour, at least. That's a huge question, and but it's a really important question because we don't have to reinvent the wheel, and resources are limited, and you want to get the biggest bang for your buck. There definitely are some lessons, and I think we learned to identify things that we knew were significant and important regulatory drivers. That kind of goes back to those conceptual models. Really evaluating what you know about a system up front and what are the big gaps and challenges to understanding those big mechanisms that are moving ecosystems. I think that's really important. And always paying attention to those fluxes and boundaries. And that was hugely significant when we really started to look at the carbon budget, which we just didn't have time to get into. So boundaries and fluxes, figure out what you know and what you don't know. Good partnerships. We have developed extraordinary partnerships with the City of Jacksonville and Onslow County and multiple agencies and organizations that work within them. So I think those are 3 good places to start.
Susan, would you like to add anything? I mean, Pat?
Yes, I think to add to Susan's, another important recommendation is to, if you want to start a large program like this, is really planning. It has to be foremost in everyone's mind. When we first started DCERP, I think the researchers really wanted to immediately run into the field to start collecting data because that's what researchers do. But instead, we had to develop our teams. The teams had to have meetings to discuss the processes that they wanted to monitor, what equipment was needed, what spatial extent and temporal frequency they wanted to use for each of the measurements, what units should be used in reporting the results because you don't want to collect information that's not comparable, and who's responsible for each measurement activity. And we laid out detailed roadmaps of who needed what data, who was going to collect the data, and things like that. I think having a team where many of the researchers are very familiar with each other and each other's work and have worked together on similar projects is also very helpful. because there was a camaraderie with the team that was really helpful in pulling everything together. And I think lastly, for a project of this size, it's really imperative that there be an on-site coordinator at the installation to help get things done for the team, because Sirte didn't want team members to be bugging the environmental management staff because they have their own role. And so we were directed to use Susan, who could put us in touch with where to store equipment, help in site selection for any of the researchers that needed to go into a special area, general logistics and just getting around the base, and also training on how not to wander into a live fire gun range while you were doing your research, which is a unique aspect of working on a live fire installation.
Great, thank you. Another broad question from the US EPA, starting with you, Susan. What follow-on research, in your opinion, is needed to better understand the complex system at Camp Lejeune?
Well, again, these are big questions, and they're important questions. So I think with regards to the forestry work and the plant community work, and I think this applies outside of DCERP as well, the follow-on is this long-term monitoring. The follow-on is understanding what just doesn't happen in 3 years or 5 years or 6 years, but forestry and plant community management and fire is a long-term endeavor. You know, we think in these long rotation period times. So somehow continuing to do some of this long-term understanding of forest dynamics, particularly as we enter into periods of climate change. I think one thing we did not study a lot directly, but we got a good sense of, is the challenges we're going to face using fire as a management tool into the future, under both, you know, increasing encroachment by urban areas and shifts in weather and climate as we move forward towards the 21st century. So I think with regards to forestry, that's just one particular area where follow-on research might be great. The coastal barrier island is so dynamic and so influenced by climate change. Continuing to refine sort of simple numeric morphology models that can be run without huge computational resources, I think it would be important follow-on research for any coastal barrier environment in a similar setting.
Great, thank you. Pat, any quick final thoughts?
I think in relation to the last question for the estuary, continued monitoring, even if it's a lower level than we were doing at DCERP, is very vital, because you've got to be able to identify if the magnitude of nutrient inputs to the estuary is increasing over time, and to keep track of the phytoplankton bloom frequency and any changes in the phytoplankton community that you see. And with regard to the marshes, I think the continuing work of Carolyn Kern to look at the impact of additional dredge spoil adding on the marshes would be good to do, and we await Carolyn's findings on this.
Thank you both for a very fascinating presentation on the work that you're doing with DCERP. I would like to remind our audience that the next webinar is on Thursday, May 17. It is in the munitions response area, and the focus will be on sediment volume search sonar. This webinar will feature Dr. Daniel Brown, a research and development engineer at the Applied Research Laboratory at Penn State. Registration is open for this webinar, so please visit the Sirte and ESTCE webinar webpage to register for this and other future webinars. Before we conclude, I would like to remind you that both the audio and a copy of the presentation of today's session will be archived on our webinar webpage in case you would like to refer to them in the future. We would appreciate it if you can please take a moment to complete the survey that will pop up on your screen at this time. This concludes today's webcast. Thank you so much for your time.